you, Diane and Mahnaz. Tonight, I'm delighted to have the honor and privilege of introducing our distinguished speaker, Dr. Peter Khan. Dr. Khan and his lovely wife, Dr. Janet Khan, reside in Haifa, Israel, and serve in the Baha'i World Community Center as a member of the International Teaching Center. Dr. Khan is originally from Australia and had, for 12 years, taught at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor as a professor of electrical engineering. To many of you here, as well as to myself, Dr. Khan is not only known for being a distinguished member of the International Teaching Center, whose duties are vast and varied, and include, just to name a few of them, if I may, to coordinate, stimulate, and direct the activities of the Continental Boards of Counselors and act as liaison between them and the Universal House of Justice. To be fully informed of the situation of the cause in all parts of the world, and to be able to make reports and recommendations to the Universal House of Justice. To be alert to possibilities for the extension of the teaching work into receptive and needy areas, and to determine and anticipate needs for literature and pioneers, and to work out teaching plans, both regional and global, for the approval of the Universal House of Justice. Now, as I said before, Dr. Khan is to many of us not only a member of the International Teaching Center, but to many of us he is considered a friend. Whether we may have met him in a meeting or in Haifa while on pilgrimage, I'm sure you will agree with me when I say that after just a short while, you cannot help but get to admire and respect him. This past year, I had the bounty of serving a few short months at the Baha'i World Center. And while there, I witnessed the love that Dr. Khan showered upon others, and especially the youth. He would take time out of his busy schedule to give the youth deepenings, and on a more personal basis, he would inquire about their welfare or encourage them in their studies and career goals, and guide them in their services for the faith. Dr. Peter Khan has visited many Baha'i communities and lectured on the Baha'i faith in every continent of the globe. Tonight he is here in Columbus and has put Columbus on the map. And his most recent trip en route to Columbus has involved going to Europe, the dedication ceremonies of the House of Worship in New Delhi. He has been to Australasia, Los Angeles, and most recently Chicago. The title of his talk tonight will be The Major and Minor Plans of God. There will be time for questions and answers after his talk. Would you please welcome Dr. Peter Khan.
Mr. Chairman and friends, as you, I'm sure, well realize, it takes a great deal of courage for somebody who is identified with Ann Arbor to come to Columbus. Despite all that, and despite the fact that the Michigan football team beat Ohio State last year, I feel very happy to be here, and it's wonderful to be able to see so many Baha'is and their friends this evening. I'm particularly grateful to those who I know have driven quite long distances from neighbouring states in order to attend this meeting and to be able to meet fellow believers from this region. As Dr. Ma'ani mentioned, my subject tonight is the major and minor plans of God. As I travel around the world, I find that there are certain issues that come up quite frequently in discussion with Baha'is and their friends. One of these is that both these groups of people are increasingly inquiring, what do the Baha'i teachings say about the future course of present-day world events? In other words, what indications, what information is there in the Baha'i writings about where the world is going? The second issue pertains very directly to the Baha'is, and it is this: why is it that there is at the present time and in recent years apparently so much emphasis placed upon Baha'i service in teaching, administration, proclamation, and other avenues in which Baha'is serve their community and the world at large? Obviously, at all times in the history of the Baha'i faith, emphasis has been placed upon this endeavour, but the emphasis does seem to be increasing in recent years. If this is the case, why so? In addressing these two issues, I find not only are they closely related, but also discussion of them involves addressing two concepts that are found in the writings of the Guardian and the Universal House of Justice, the concepts of the major and minor plans of God, the terms used in those writings, which I will discuss as I proceed. Let me begin by going through what I believe to be a few fairly general points which pertain fundamentally to these two issues that I have raised. General points about the Baha'i teachings or the Baha'i concepts of its relationship to the world. The first of the points is this: my understanding is that the Baha'i teachings indicate to us that history, the course of world events, is not random or purposeless, but rather is purposeful and directional towards a clearly stated goal. In other words, it is my understanding that as Baha'is we believe that the world is headed to a clearly stated condition set out in the Baha'i teachings. The Baha'i teachings seem to me to indicate that there is individual free will. We have choice in our actions, in the value of those actions. We are held to account. We are, if you will, judged by virtue of the decisions we make. But in the aggregate, humanity as a whole is proceeding to a goal which is predetermined, or if you will, predestined. This concept of some aspect of human affairs being predestined is an unusual and to many people a distasteful idea. Yet so many aspects of our life are in fact predetermined. Our physical evolution as individuals has a predetermined character to it. We know that small children grow up to be youths and then adults and then proceed to age and ultimately pass away. It is predetermined that, other things being equal, children will become adults. It is predetermined that adults will eventually die. There are these predetermined aspects of the evolution of an organic unit such as a human being. And it seems to me the Baha'i teachings indicate to us that not only are individuals organic units, but the whole of mankind is also an organic unit as a composite. And as such, it is subject to a process of evolution through stages that are preset in much the same way as the individual goes through various stages of his physical evolution. And in that sense, the Baha'i teachings offer us the certainty, the conviction that mankind is proceeding to a condition of world unity, world peace, and the development of world civilization. There are several consequences to this. As I'm sure many or all of you realize, one of the notable events in Baha'i international activities over the last 15 or 18 months has been that the head of our faith, the Universal House of Justice, prepared and distributed a statement on peace, the promise of world peace. And this has now been distributed all over the surface of the earth. It has, as I'm sure you realize, attracted a great deal of favourable attention from presidents, prime ministers, heads of state, leading citizens and leaders of thought in a variety of disciplines. One of the many favourable statements about this document, which recurs in the comments of many people who are not Baha'is, is that in this document they find not only an interesting, original and a practical approach to the achievement of world peace, but that in that document they find expressed the conviction that world peace is inevitable. In that sense, this document differs very markedly from the multitude of statements about world peace which appeared in 1986 during International Year of Peace designated by the United Nations. Those statements, in their various forms, spoke of mankind's hope, desire, aim for peace. They expressed the hope that conditions would come about and peace would occur. They expressed a yearning for peace. In the Universal House of Justice document, you find all those sentiments, the hope, the yearning, the desire, but in addition, you find the conviction that it is definitely going to occur. And that conviction is one of its distinguishing features, intriguing people who are not Baha'is, causing them to inquire, why is it that Baha'is are convinced that world unity and world peace will come about, even though we are hopefully very realistic about the present condition of the world and the barriers to the coming of world peace and world unity. We're hopefully not utopian idealists, but rather practical people who know there are very major and significant barriers that I'll talk about presently. Another implication to this conviction expressed in the Baha'i teachings is found in the very important and very significant message to the Baha'i youth of the world issued by the Universal House of Justice on 8th of May 1985. In that message, which is in many ways the charter for the future activities of those who are presently the Baha'i youth of the world, in that document one finds, among other things, that the House of Justice calls upon the young Baha'is to manifest assurance and optimism about the future of mankind. And when I read that, I said to myself, how can one do that? You can't legislate to make people assured and optimistic. You can't say to somebody, hey you, I want you from now on to be optimistic. What will happen is the opposite effect. You'll terrify the poor person, they'll become pessimistic rather than optimistic. So I said to myself, given the fact that the House of Justice advises the Baha'i youth to manifest optimism and assurance, how can they do that? And my impression is that this is best done if the Baha'is, especially the young Baha'is, if you will, so thoroughly immerse themselves in an understanding of the writings of the Guardian and the Universal House of Justice, that they reflect automatically in their thinking and in their behaviour the conviction about world peace and world unity which is found in those writings. If this conviction is internalized in our lives, it becomes reflected in our unconscious as well as conscious behaviour, in our body language, in our approach to world events or to what we see on television or read on the newspapers, then this assurance and optimism will become an integral part of our being, and we will be fulfilling the advice given by the Universal House of Justice. The second point that I want to address is this concept of the major plan of God. It's a phrase used by the Guardian in several places, especially in a message of 1955 in the book Citadel of Faith, as well as elsewhere, and the House of Justice also discuss it in a message in Wellspring of Guidance. My understanding is it refers to the fact that with this present age, this age of critical transition, this age when technology and communication and transportation and the forces of democracy and civilization are all converging, and mankind is in transition towards world unity. At this time, in these centuries of transition, the Spirit of God, the power of the Holy Spirit, is being manifested and having its effect in the world, not only in the animation and operation of the Baha'i community, but in the world at large, as the Guardian discusses in Promised Days Come. And this force of the Spirit of God working through the world is in the large shaping world events. And my understanding of the term major plan of God as used in our writings is this, that through the operation of the power of the Holy Spirit moving mankind on to its appointment with its destiny, we see in the world two processes, a process of decline and a process of growth. The decline is very apparent. Decline, disorder, disintegration, war, turmoil, breakdown of society, and the like. It is very evident, it's very dramatic, it's very apparent to all of us. In addition, we are told in the writings, and we see it if we look closely at the evolution of society, there is a process of integration and growth occurring in the world. And the writings speak of the operation of these processes as being part and parcel of this major plan of God. It says that these two processes will continue with accelerating momentum. More and more people will become caught up in the growing process. It will dominate in the future, and the world will go through its stage of transition to the achievement of unity and peace. So, the writings of our faith on the major plan of God offer a comprehensive and important model, a model of what's happening in the world and where things are going, a model, a framework in which to fit the various events that occur on a day-to-day basis in the news, in world events, in the trends of thought and the like. All of these things, as they appear, can be fitted into place in the model, the framework described by the Guardian and elaborated in several places by the Universal House of Justice. Without that model, it looks confusing, it looks a source of despair and pessimism, it looks to be going nowhere, we're going ahead a little bit, then going backwards and going off in all directions and the like. With that model given by the Guardian, it all fits into place. We see the evolution of mankind, we see the process of decline, the process of growth, interacting with each other, leading mankind ultimately to unity. There are several consequences of this model. Obviously, I'm not describing the model, I'm referring you to it in the World Order of Baha'u'llah, principally, as well as in some other places. This model has some important consequences. The first is this: I believe that we can only correctly perceive the significance of world events if we measure them against the model given by the Guardian and the House of Justice. Let me give you some examples. For example, consider President Wilson. He's formulated the 14 points that are regarded as one of the foundations of the League of Nations after World War I. Despite his best efforts, he was unable to persuade Congress to vote for the United States to enter the League of Nations. Ultimately, his presidency was judged a failure. He passed away. What is intriguing is that you find that the Guardian in several places refers to President Wilson, to his actions, his labours for the setting up of the League of Nations. He praises that president, describes him as a largely unappreciated figure, as a person of outstanding vision and accomplishment, and he refers to the actions of President Wilson in a phrase which we might well regard as somewhat mysterious. He says in the book Citadel of Faith that those actions of President Wilson constituted the dawn of the most great peace. This is a very surprising statement. If he had said the dawn of the lesser peace, it would be more readily comprehensible. But he says the dawn of the most great peace, that those actions of President Wilson set in motion the acceleration of the integrating forces through the giving rise to the League of Nations, the consequent development of internationalism, which ultimately lead through the lesser peace to the most great peace. So I offer it as an example of how the perspective of the Guardian differs from that of contemporary analysts of the presidential scene. Let me take another example. In the mid-1930s, the government of Italy decided to invade Ethiopia, or Abyssinia. Italian troops moved down to northern Africa, invaded and occupied Ethiopia. The League of Nations met in session and branded the Italian action as aggression, called upon Italy to withdraw its army from Ethiopia. Italy refused. The League of Nations then decided it would take action against Italy. And the action it took was to call upon all the member states of the League of Nations, in fact all the nations of the world, to join together and impose collective sanctions of trade upon Italy. Basically it said nobody trade with Italy until Italy withdraws its army from Ethiopia, and the pressure of this isolation of Italy from world trade will compel the Italian government to withdraw its army. Well, the measure failed. First, one nation surreptitiously traded with Italy, then another nation, then several, then a whole lot openly. The sanction didn't work, was regarded as ineffective. Contemporary political analysts regard that as a great failure of the League of Nations. They say, look at this League of Nations, look how powerless it was. Italy invaded Ethiopia, the League of Nations could do nothing about it. Their attempt to impose sanctions was a paper tiger, had no effect. It was all a big waste of time. What a terrible thing. The Guardian comments on this in his published writings, and he hails that action of the League of Nations as a major step forward in the course of human events. So now we have an interesting situation. We have the mass of world political commentators assessing it one way, the Guardian assessing it in a diametrically opposite way. And hence I make my point that our correct understanding of the significance of world events is best obtained by reference to the model of world events contained in our writings. Why does the Guardian go off in the opposite direction? He points out that when the League of Nations imposed those collective economic sanctions, even though it was a failure, it nevertheless represented a great step forward because it was the first time mankind as a whole had attempted to apply a general and important principle advocated by Baha'u'llah. Baha'u'llah, in his plan for world peace and world unity, speaks of a time when the nations of the world will put down by collective action an aggressor government. And the Guardian said this was a wonderful step forward. It was the first time the nations had tried to take collective action through an international body against an aggressor. Never mind that it failed, the fact that they even tried was a great step forward. It reminded me of the attitude of parents towards their baby when the baby goes through the stage from crawling to walking. The very first time the child tries to walk, he or she takes one or two halting steps and falls over. And if we looked at it coldly and analytically, we could say failure. The kid tried, it didn't make it. A waste of time, all it did was put a dent in the floor. But in fact, the parents don't look at it that way. They say victory. The fact that the child even tried to walk is a great step forward. It'll try again, and maybe it'll fall over again, and it might take several weeks, but we know that it has taken I was going to say a step forward, if you pardon the use of the phrase, that it's taken a great step forward in the evolution of its progress. They look at it in an evolutionary manner from a long-term perspective and see that the first time the child tried to walk was a major step forward compared to its crawling before. And so it is the Guardian assesses that action of the League of Nations in the 1930s quite differently from the way the world looks at it. So my point once again is that world events, events that may appear very minor or insignificant or trivial or may appear to be failures, may well appear quite different when looked at from this evolutionary long-term perspective of the twin processes of decline and growth enunciated and explained in some detail by the Guardian and by the Universal House of Justice. And there are many other features to this which I won't go into because it would take too much time. But for example, the role of the United States in the world scene, which of course is a subject of controversy on the world scene, and there's a degree of misgiving and even suspicion of distrust of the United States, obviously in foreign quarters. We find the Guardian has spoken of this at great length. And when I was in Wilmette a couple of days ago, I was shown a copy of the most recent issue of the American Baha'i. And in that issue you'll find an article of about a page and a half, which is a transcript of a talk given on this subject some time ago on the role of America in the world scene from passages of the Guardian in several books, and that I think also conveys this point. If we are as a whole to avoid the pessimism and despair, the desperation, the extremism, the disillusion which is infecting more and more people of our society as they see the apparent hopelessness of attempts to create harmony and peace and unity in the world, if we are to avoid this, our best solution is to immerse ourselves in deepening in the writings of the Guardian and the House of Justice. By obtaining the perspective of those writings, we will automatically become optimistic about the future while retaining our realism. It's easy to be optimistic if you're unrealistic. If you don't read the newspapers, if you don't know what's going on, you can say everything's wonderful, it's evolving, it's coming, unity is in the air, and so on. And people who will say, but what about this country? What about this? What about that? Will immediately burst the bubble. What we as Baha'is should be, in my opinion, is be very well informed, very realistic, very practical in our perception of the world and its barriers and its needs and conditions, and within that we should, through our perception of the spiritual forces at work in the world, we should be optimistic. The term minor plan of God is used in the writings to describe the process by which the Baha'i faith is established throughout the world. As you well realize, this process occurs through a series of plans. 6-year plans, 7-year plans, 5-year plans, 10-year plans, all kinds of things. And the Guardian has in one place pointed out the great contrast between the operation of the major plan of God and the minor plan. He said the minor plan occurs or develops through a systematic and well understood manner. Systematic in the sense that we make systematic plans, local, national and international, and coordinate them to the much extent possible. And they're well understood. We tell people, and people know what the plan is and where we're going collectively and the like. Whereas the major plan of God is not well understood. It is mysterious and spasmodic. And often its effect is unclear. The Guardian first, to my knowledge, discussed this in detail in his message of 1955 in Citadel of Faith, a message he wrote at the time when the Baha'is in Iran were being subject to persecution. And obviously we all were lamenting that fact. The Guardian wrote a very comprehensive and detailed message in which he shared our lamentation about the horrors being inflicted upon the Baha'i community at that time, horrors which have paled into insignificance in recent years. But he said, these things are terrible, they are happening, they are retarding the immediate progress of the faith, but he said they're all part of the major plan of God. They're not out of schedule, they're not unpredicted, they're not random. It is part of the major plan of God. It will lead to the ultimate eradication of barriers to the progress of the faith in the native land of Baha'u'llah. So in that sense, all these events, likewise, we can see how the minor plan of God proceeds in a well understood, systematic way. The major plan of God is often not well understood. It is unexpected. It is unpredictable to us because of our limited perspective. And often it is only later we can look back and see what was its purpose and how it contributed to the evolution of mankind as a whole. One might well inquire, why is it that we are called upon to devote our energies to this minor plan of God, the spread of the Baha'i faith around the world? Is it simply because we feel kind of lonely with few Baha'is around, we'd like to have some more to talk to, and we feel a sense of sort of gratification if our religion was spread in the world? If that is our motive, it's a very selfish motive and a very unworthy motive. Our purpose in spreading the Baha'i faith is not simply to add one more religion to a world which already is burdened with a multitude of religions. Our purpose, as best I understand it, is that we believe that the Baha'i faith in this age is a vehicle, a means to an end. It is a vehicle for the transmission of spiritual values, spiritual practices, and a spiritual power which will lead people to enduring happiness, to a sense of community and unity with each other. To us, the Baha'i faith is very important, but it is not an end in itself. It is the means to this vital end, that these spiritual values and practices and powers may be established in the hearts of men across the world, that they may achieve true happiness and a sense of community and unity with each other. This is our purpose, this is our goal. Now, before I conclude, let me turn to the years which lie immediately ahead. It is my understanding that our teachings indicate that in the years to come, in the years of the immediate future, the next decade or so, there will be significant developments in both the major and minor plans of God. First, the major plan. There are several places in the authoritative Baha'i writings which indicate that Abdu'l-Baha has assured us that before the end of the 20th century, a condition which is described as the lesser peace will be initiated or will come into being. Now, what do we mean by the lesser peace? My impression is it refers to that condition when the nations of mankind will agree, each nation, to give up part of its national sovereignty to the formation of an international government, which will have an executive police force sufficient to put down by force, if necessary, an aggressor government. That structure will be a means to enforce or maintain peace. It won't necessarily stop aggression, but it'll stop aggression getting away from us. It will be a guardian and a preserver of peace, initially through its power to put down by force an aggressor government. It'll obviously have a lot of psychological and implications in political understanding and the rise of internationalism and the like, but in its initial form, this is what it will be. The guardian in From a Day Is Come refers to the stage of world unity which, as Abdu'l-Baha assures us, will in this century be securely established. So he tells us that Abdu'l-Baha assured us that in this 20th century, because the context makes it clear it's the 20th century, that in this 20th century world unity will be securely established. If that was all we had in the writings, there'd be a considerable degree of ambiguity. Does world unity refer to the lesser peace or to some other condition? That ambiguity has been removed by a clarification of the Universal House of Justice in November 1973, where they said that the statements about the lesser peace are referred to in that statement of the Guardian that I just read out. So it clarifies that the world unity that Abdu'l-Baha assured us would come in the 20th century is in fact the lesser peace. And all these passages are quoted in the compilation on peace issued by the Research Department of the Universal House of Justice late in 1985. I think it was August or September 85. So, within the next 13 years, Abdu'l-Baha has assured us that world unity and world peace will be initiated through the coming of the lesser peace. It's an assurance provided in our writings. And when you think about it, if you observe the present day world scene, nothing looks more unlikely than that the nations of the world will in the next 13 years excuse me, give up part of their national sovereignty. If you observe the political thinking, the ethos, the policy of nations, it seems unimaginable that any one nation, much less an aggregate of nations, will agree in this limited time ahead for the end of the 20th century, will agree to give up part of their national sovereignty. Can we imagine France doing that? Germany, the Soviet Union, the United States of America, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, New Zealand, India, Japan, any other country? Which of those countries seems in the present line of thinking to be prepared to give up part of their national sovereignty to an international government? And my perception is that not one of them appears likely to do so. Yet we have the assurance of Abdu'l-Baha that not only will one, but a whole lot of them will, and the international government will come into being in the next 13 years. How is this puzzle resolved? I believe it is resolved by published statements of The Guardian which refer to a condition of trial and turmoil which will lead to that foretold condition. The Guardian uses a phrase which has passed into the Baha'i lexicon, the phrase, or the word, calamity. And he refers to calamity or catastrophe as being the motive force to bring this about. For example, in a message in the book Messages of the Baha'i World, the Guardian refers to the coming of what he calls calamity which must purge the human race of the dross of its age-old corruptions and weld its component parts into a firmly knit, world-embracing fellowship. So he's referring to turmoil, trouble, disorder, travail in the world, which will not only purge the human race of the dross of age-old corruptions, of selfishness and prejudice and base intentions towards other nations, but will also weld the component parts into a firmly knit, world-embracing fellowship. So it'll be through calamity or turmoil that this presently unlikely condition will come into being. Having raised this issue of calamity or catastrophe, we now find ourselves in a great deal of difficulty. The difficulty is this, that anybody who's been a Baha'i for more than maybe 15 or 20 minutes will find that the term calamity or catastrophe is irrevocably associated with pilgrim notes. And that these pilgrim notes differ quite markedly from the published writings. The published writings speak of obsolescent doctrines, of the breakdown of barriers to unity, turmoil, travail, and the like. The pilgrim notes speak of the evaporation of New York, the destruction of Chicago, the San Andreas fault, the horrors awaiting Los Angeles and San Francisco and all kinds of other cities. They're very dramatic and lurid and specific. And so naturally people are attracted to pilgrim notes. They're a lot more fun, a lot more interesting than the published writings. Nevertheless, the fact remains that our teachings are clear that while we are not forbidden to read pilgrim notes, and they are in many ways entertaining to people of that kind of mind, nevertheless, they are not reliable, they are not authoritative, and we are encouraged again and again not to place our reliance upon them. And obviously that's easier said than done. I came across this issue some years ago when I lived up in Michigan. I dare not mention the city again. I was at that time assigned to serve, among others, the Baha'is of New York State, including New York City. And this was about 12, 13 years ago, when the New York City Local Assembly was considering the purchase of what is now its present-day Baha'i Center in Lower Manhattan. And they were thinking of spending $200,000 on its purchase. And so, in working with that assembly and offering it whatever counsel and advice I could, the question arose to the members of the Assembly and to myself, was this the appropriate thing to do? Was it wise to spend $200,000 of Baha'i money on a building in Lower Manhattan if the whole thing was going to evaporate? You can see that from a real estate perspective, it wouldn't appear to be a very good investment. So I thought I ought to look into this a little more detail. And I found that at the time the Guardian was reputed to have made these remarks about the evaporation of New York, there were a group of pilgrims who were all together for the same 9 days when the Guardian spoke of this. And intriguingly enough, those pilgrims divided into two groups, not antagonistic groups, but two categories. One category said, we heard the Guardian say that. He said New York would evaporate. The other group said, we heard something different. Well, this was very strange. I said, how could you hear something different? You know, it seems very simple and very straightforward. So I talked to the first group, and they were adamant that that was what they heard. I talked to believers in the second category, and they said, we heard something different. I said, well, was he talking about New York? They said, yes. I said, did he use the word evaporate? They said, yes. I said, well, for heaven's sake, what else could he have said? If he said evaporate and he said New York, how else was it used? So they said it was used differently. I said, okay, tell me. They said that the Guardian was speaking of the fact that Abdu'l-Baha had designated New York City as the city of the covenant, which we all know, I'm sure. And they said that the Guardian referred to the problems in New York City, which are very evident to anybody, and the Guardian said that there would come a time when the tone and character, the people of New York, would change very suddenly, and they would become a very spiritual people, and it would become a city of great spirituality. And the Guardian said this change would occur abruptly, dramatically, quickly. And the Guardian wanted to illustrate how rapidly such change can occur, and he took the analogy. And he said it'll be like as if you took a hot pavement, as in the height of summer, and you poured water on the pavement, and the pavement is wet. And as you watch, and the hot sun is beating down, and the pavement's hot, you poured the water there. As you watch, suddenly it becomes dry, the water evaporates. And if you do this, you'll find it doesn't evaporate in bits and pieces and splodges. One moment it's all wet, the next moment it's all dry. It has suddenly changed. And he used the term evaporate in that sense to refer to the change in New York. Well, we have two groups of people who were present at the same time who heard essentially the same verbs and nouns, but in a different arrangement with a radically different meaning. Which of those two groups is correct, we don't know. We weren't there. But what one can point out is that two groups of sincere, devoted believers, each feeling that they were expressing the Guardian's words as accurately as possible, have come to quite diametrically opposite conclusions about what he said. And the first group have a real juicy morsel, so they wrote their pilgrim notes. The second group didn't have a juicy morsel, they didn't write and circulate their pilgrim notes. So that illustrated to me the hazards that are associated with pilgrim notes. To us, it's almost an academic question. We don't live in New York City. It's more only of interest to us. But there are believers who lived in New York who became just sheer terrified over those pilgrim notes. To them it wasn't a question of analysis or debate or inquiry. It was something that caused them to radically change the course of their lives. And was it justified or not? That depends upon which of the two groups of people you believe. Now, the House of Justice has, in the court's 6-year plan, in giving us the message about the 6-year plan, they've said that it will conclude in Rizwan 1992, and it will be followed by the second Baha'i World Congress to be held in the City of the Covenant, New York City, in the latter part of November 1992. So that one might take as some sort of inference about the House of Justice's expectations about the future of New York City. And I don't know to what extent you're aware of the National Spiritual Assembly of the United States is already engaged in very detailed planning about that World Congress. Preliminary estimates of, say, 50 to 60,000 Baha'is will be present. The Jacob K. Javits Convention Center, it's on 33rd to 35th Street or 36th Street in Manhattan. We've apparently been able to rent that, and thought has been given to the hotels where Baha'is will be accommodated, and people will be bussed in from Connecticut and New Jersey, and there'll be hopefully live satellite linkage to Baha'i conferences in other continents at the same time, where Baha'is who can't come to New York can still gather in certain cities of other continents and participate by video linkage with the major conference, all these kinds of things. And now, because to plan an event like that, you don't do it in the last year, you take the whole 6 years are required to do it. So it's all coming along. Well, that's by the way. The point is, the Guardian has told us repeatedly that we should not rely on pilgrim notes. There's nothing wrong if you want to read them, it's perfectly all right. But we are advised not to place our reliance upon them. He says in one place that even if you hear the same sentiment from a variety of pilgrims, still don't rely on it. Even if you hear it from a so-called well-known Baha'i or so-called important Baha'i, still don't rely on it, because there are these hazards involved in it. Some of the other hazards are more subtle. My impression from talking to Amatul Bahar Rahir Khanum and others who were with the Guardian on many occasions was that in many times he would speak in a conditional manner. He would say, if thus and so, then this and this. And this was often so dramatic to the believers they missed the conditionality of it. On other occasions it was more subtle. Now this is all my personal theory because I'm very interested in this subject. The Guardian was not only rational and logical and a brilliant administrator and organizer, he was also a supremely creative mind. That creativity is reflected in his writings, in his organisation of the Baha'i Gardens, in his vision of the future. And as a creative mind, my impression is that he would explore various lines of thinking. So tonight he would meet with the pilgrims and explore this as a possibility, as a line of thinking, as a line of logical thought. Next week he'd meet with the pilgrims and explore a different line of thought, which may be contradictory to the earlier one. Neither one was an authoritative statement, was almost a talking out loud of a variety of possibilities and ideas. So if one is aware that some of his statements about the future are conditional, for example his statement, American Baha'is in Time of World Peril, written in May 1954, has a number of conditional elements to it which are generally ignored. But if you're aware of the conditionality and the operation of creativity in some of his verbal statements, as well as the misunderstandings like with this evaporation in New York, it does help us to understand why we are encouraged again and again not to place our reliance on pilgrim notes. Well then, forgetting about pilgrim notes, what is there in the authoritative writings? A couple of years ago, the International Teaching Centre, of which I'm presently a member, decided we would collect everything we could find that was authoritative on this subject. And we had access to the documents collected by the Universal House of Justice, all the letters of the Guardian and of course the letters of the House of Justice. We said to our research department, send us everything you have on the subject, and they did. And we found that the Guardian's letters answering questions from the believers about the form of this calamity were all of the same kind. And he said in many places over and over again till the end of his life in writing, he said, and this is a passage from one letter, we have no indication of exactly what nature the apocalyptic upheaval will be. He said, we don't know, we have no idea, we have no indication exactly what nature. We know generally, we know certain issues about it, but exactly what, we have no indication. After the passing of the Guardian and the coming into being of the Universal House of Justice, believers wrote to the House of Justice and said, what about it? When and how and why and whatever. And the House of Justice answered in this form. They said, although there is every reason to expect that the world will experience travail and testing as never before, we do not know what form these upheavals will take, when exactly they will come, how severe they will be, nor how long they will last. Those are all the things we don't know. Well, if I come to you and say, look, I want to tell you about something, and you say to me, okay, Peter, what do you know about? I'll say, well, I'm sorry, I don't know when it'll come, what form it'll take, how long it'll last, or what form it'll come, how severe it'll be. You would conclude that I really don't know much about it. You say, well, what? So, the House of Justice has in writing again and again said that it does not know those things. It is the head of our faith, it is endowed with the inspiration conferred by Baha'u'llah, and it said it doesn't know these things. I remember talking about this to a person on one occasion. He offered the ingenious theory that in fact the House of Justice did know, but it wasn't telling us because it would frighten us. Well, when you think about that theory, to accept it, you have to accept the fact that the House of Justice tells us a lie. Because here we have letters where they say, we don't know. Are they telling the truth or are they lying? And I think the answer is obvious. As the head of our faith, as our example of collective action, as our supreme body, it obviously is not in the business of lying. If it says it doesn't know, it doesn't know. This leads us to the point, if the House of Justice doesn't know what form it'll take, what are we to do? And that point is resolved over and over again in the guidance of the Guardian and the House of Justice. They tell us over and over again that the believers, through their service to the faith, through their immersion in the teachings, their practice of the teachings, that is the best possible preparation for what is coming in the future. That is an action of self-defense and self-preparation for the future. The House of Justice wrote in 1984, February 84, in fact, I guess that's 3 years ago, about conditions in Europe, but they made general statements. They said the believers should understand that a catastrophic breakdown of human society as a result of mankind's ignoring his message, that Baha'u'llah's message, has been clearly foretold by Baha'u'llah, and we are indeed in the midst of such a breakdown. So we don't know the form, but the House of Justice refers to a catastrophic breakdown of human society, and they said we're in the midst of it. The main concern of the Baha'is should be not how to preserve themselves physically, but how to seize the opportunities that these conditions present to convey the healing teachings of the faith to their fellow citizens. And the point I get from that is that the details of whatever calamity and catastrophe are to come are unknown. But what we do know is that our best way of helping mankind and helping ourselves is through our immersion in Baha'i practice and the spread of the Baha'i faith, the development of the Baha'i community. You might say, well, what's one got to do with the other? I think the linkage lies in the fact that the House of Justice characterizes this period of turmoil and calamity as a catastrophic breakdown of human society. And through our development of the Baha'i community, we are creating a new society. My observation in talking to people who've been through a whole lot of suffering is that the greatest suffering human beings experience is through the breakdown of human relations. People suffer when they lose their job, they lose their house, they're driven out of their country as refugees. All these things, the loss of possessions, the loss of the stability of the environment of one's life, causes deep suffering. But my perception is that people suffer even more when human relations break down, when there is disintegration of marriage and family and of a web or a network of friends or people that care for you or are interested in you. That seems to be the greater suffering that people go through. And through our spread of the Baha'i faith, the development of the Baha'i community, we create the antidote to whatever will come in the future, which will be basically a breakdown of human society, because we will create bonds of unity and caring and compassion and understanding of each other, which will be the shell to protect us against the breakdown of human society. So we are not left without guidance for these unknown events, and that guidance lies in the creation of a unified and warm society toward the future. Finally, we make a mention of the minor plan of God before I stop. My impression is that not only will be these dramatic events in the major plan of God in the next 13 years, but the minor plan likewise. Because as I travel around the world, my observation is that there is a growing and deeply spread thirst for true religious values in the world today. It's growing very rapidly, and it's very strong in our society and getting stronger. However, in the past, in past ages, when there was this desire for true religious values, it was channeled into adherence to one of the organized religions. It's religious revivals, and many, many people joined a religion. Today, that thirst for true religious values is not being manifest in a mass joining of an organized religion, whether it's the Baha'i faith or the Catholic or Protestant churches or Buddhism or Islam or whatever. It's being channeled in other ways at the present time. You see that thirst expressed in the rise of loneliness as one of the major problems of human society, in the extremism with which people are embracing a variety of causes, saving the whale, protecting the environment, inhibiting the deployment of the cruise missile, trying to bring about nuclear disarmament and the like. A variety of causes around the world are being embraced with the kind of passion previously reserved for religion. The desire for heroes is another expression of this search for true religious values. At risk of speaking too long, let me tell you very quickly of something I read in a magazine last year which brought home to me some of these issues. It was an interview conducted with a tennis star called Boris Becker. Some of you might have heard of him. He's a young German teenager who's won the Wimbledon Tennis Championship the last 2 years in succession. And Boris Becker was playing tennis in Germany about a year ago, I think. And at the end of the match, or sometime later, he was interviewed by a news reporter, and he described his experience. And basically he said he got frightened during the tennis match. And the reporter said to Boris Becker, "What frightened you?" He said, "I looked at the crowd." He was playing in Germany, first German to win Wimbledon. He said, "I looked at the crowd and I saw the way they were looking at me, and that frightened me." And he said, and I'm just paraphrasing his words, that they were looking at him with a fixed expression, following his every move as if he were a hero to be worshipped. He said as he looked at them, he realized that in their eyes he could do no wrong. And he said then he understood that he could have led that crowd anywhere he wanted to go. And Becker says in that interview that he said, when I saw that crowd, I was frightened, because he said, then I could understand Nuremberg. Then he could understand Hitler. in this desire for heroes. And this doesn't mean the German people are any worse or better than the people of any other part of the world, but it's an indication of the human desire for something to commit oneself to, some heroic ideal, some heroic individual to whom one could commit oneself, much as Beethoven in writing Eroica was occupied with the same sentiment. So this, I think, is all part of this growing thirst for true religious values. At present, it's not being directed principally into the Baha'i faith. We've had lots of proclamation in 1985 and 1986, and a very, very minuscule number of people have joined the faith. A lot of more people know about it, but not a lot are coming into it. Because this thirst for religious values is being directed in all kinds of other movements and heroes and the adulation of rock stars and sports stars and all kinds of things. But what we want is for the Baha'is to persevere and continue in their efforts to teach and practice the faith, confident that that thirst, through its succession of clay idols, will ultimately be led to find the true satisfaction to that thirst in the Baha'i teachings. It'll come eventually, but we'll have to persevere until it occurs. I conclude my talk with this sentiment. One thing that I have been puzzled by from time to time is that the repeated calls to service issued by the head of our faith, by the Universal House of Justice, never at any time include an element of apology. The House of Justice never says to us, look friends, we know you're busy, you're having trouble with unemployment and inflation and the problems of breakdown of families and all these other things. We know that these things are harassing you. We're sorry to have to ask you, but we need more teaching, more assemblies, more funds, etc. There's never any element of apology in the calls for service and for support issued by the World Centre. And I have said to myself, why is this so? Because I know that the House of Justice is very clearly aware of what's going on in the world and the problems that individual believers face in their daily lives. Given that awareness, why don't they say, we're awfully sorry to have to say this to you, but please, we need this. It never happens. And as I pondered this issue, it occurred to me that the answer to that question of why doesn't the House of Justice ever apologise in calling us to service, that the answer to that question is found in a most unusual place. It's found, I believe, in the letters which have been written by those Baha'is in the last 7 or 8 years who were on the point of martyrdom in Iran. As you know, we have suffered 189 or 190 martyrs in Iran in the last 7 or so years, and in several instances, those believers, when they were about to be martyred, had an opportunity to very hurriedly scribble a few words addressed to their spouse or their family or their friends, or to convey a verbal message. And I've thought about the content of their letters a great deal, because it seems to me that there are certain times in one's life when one's values become clarified, when you see that that's what it's really about, that's what's really going on. And I suspect that these believers, knowing they were at the point of being put to death for their religion, that at that time their values became clarified, that they saw clearly what it was all about, what life really was for, that faced with the prospect that in a few minutes they were going to die for their religion, they had a moment or a period of clarity. And you find in their letters repeatedly the sentiment of gratitude for their privilege of being able to offer their lives for the cause. You don't find in those letters, and we've collected a number of them in the Holy Land, and several of them have been published, you don't find them saying, what a terrible thing, I'm only 35 years old and I'm going to die. Rather they say, I thank God that I have been given the opportunity to offer my life for the sake of the cause, to demonstrate the steadfastness and the quality of my belief. Their letters, although they lament the separation for their loved ones, their letters are expressions of gratitude for the privilege of service. And when I thought about that, I said to myself, now I understand why the House of Justice doesn't apologize when it's calling us to service and action. Because in a sense, it's doing us a favor. Because as the martyrs of Iran point out in those letters, this is what it's all about. This is the clarification of values. These are the truly important dimensions to our lives. This is what those friends saw at the point of their martyrdom. This is why we are privileged to make the sacrifices required at the present time with all the other things going on, the inflation, the unemployment, the turmoil, the social breakdown, the hazards, all the rest. This is why we are truly privileged to do that, because, as the martyrs have pointed out, this is what life really is all about. When it's at its fundamental form, when one is faced with the prospect of death, this is what the true issue really is. Thank you.
If there's any questions for Dr. Khan, please.
Yes, Marvin.
You're very pleased with the response to the peace message. I wonder, does the Universal House of Justice yet a standard of response? Do you follow my question? That they will call sufficient by the peoples of the world?
Oh, I see, yes. My question concerns the fact that there seems to be a very favourable response to the peace statement in the world, and he inquires, does the House of Justice have some measuring stick? Does it say this is an adequate response by the world or this isn't? I don't know of any such standard or measuring stick. My statement was based upon my observation that the peace statement has been received in a surprisingly positive way. It's been given to a lot of hard-nosed, down-to-earth, realistic, very practical politicians in a variety of countries in the world who in years gone by would have been likely to dismiss it as another bunch of utopian idealists talking about world unity and world order, ignorant of what really is happening in the world. In fact, the peace statement has been received very favourably, been very intelligent commentaries made upon it, very serious inquiry into its issues, into our approach to its realisation by these hard-nosed practical politicians. What my observation also is, and this is just a personal impression, is that by issuing the peace statement, we've set in motion a process which will continue for many years. It wasn't a one-shot, wasn't it? Here is a peace statement, take it or leave it. If you don't take it, you're in all kinds of trouble. Rather, it was the beginning of a process. In 1986, the Baha'i community did something it had never done before. It distributed 1 million copies of this document in 60 languages all over the world. Never before in history have we distributed so many copies of such a document in so many languages in such a short time. In 1 year, 1 million copies as best I understand it. And we're only getting started. There are many, many millions of copies to be distributed in the years to come, so that the ideas in this statement will gradually percolate through society. people will inquire, they will dispute it, they will say it doesn't make sense, why do you say this, what do you mean by that, I don't agree with this, I do, and so on. And it'll become a topic of discussion and analysis and inquiry. While all that is going on, the sentiment of the House of Justice about the Baha'i community being a model will become more and more fully realized. Let me take an example. Consider South Africa, which of course is very much in the world news with the problems of tension between the races in South Africa. The National Spiritual Assembly of South Africa sent a delegation to meet with State Premier P.W. Bertha and presented him with the peace statement on behalf of the Baha'i community of South Africa. And they called his attention to the fact that in that peace statement we refer to the Baha'i community as a model. And essentially they said in a polite and respectful way, look, we know you have a problem. The problem is the country with its racial tensions. Right in your midst, as the government of South Africa well realizes, we have a Baha'i community. That Baha'i community has white people, black people, and the so-called coloured people, the East Indians and the people of mixed race. They've been there for many years. They have demonstrated their commitment to unity, to harmony between the various elements. They're South Africans, they're not a whole bunch of imports. They're South Africans. They have preserved and developed what are generally regarded as civilized values. This is a model for your country. You're looking for a way of holding your country together. Look, here we are right in front of your eyes, South Africans, black, white and coloured, who are unified. And so our peace statement in South Africa is attracting interest and favourable attention from white South Africans, Afrikaan, people of Afrikaner background who are coming into the faith in the last year or so, as well as, of course, black Africans in South Africa and other places. So this model is a very crucial element of it, and the demonstration of that model in years to come will be a vital part of showing mankind the plausibility and ultimately the indispensability of the Baha'i approach to it. So it's a process, and it's got off to an unusually good start. There was someone down yonder, yeah.
Next week, Don Rogers,
Yes.
the counselor
Right.
in Canada, will also be in the area to visit us.
Yes.
And my understanding is he meets supposed to meet especially with women and youth. And I don't want to be doing any of that thunder, but
Sure.
I wanted to give sort of a preview of
Yes.
what it is he wants to say.
Sure.
I understand he's going to talk. Give us a message from the University of Justice.
Yes, yes. Very simply, I don't have the faintest idea. I didn't even know he was going to do it. Don Rogers, I'm sure a few of you know, he's a Baha'i who was appointed to the Continental Board of Councils for the Americas in November 1985. He was previously an auxiliary board member. He's been a Baha'i for many years. He's well known as a very creative and interesting person. In his profession, he's a painter. He's an artist of international repute. He's very well known in Canada, and I was in Iceland once in Reykjavik, and they were having an exhibition of his paintings, and it seemed very popular with the people of Iceland, so obviously he's known in countries outside Canada for his paintings. He also is a professor of art at a university in Saskatoon, Canada, so he has interesting credentials in his larger dimensions of his life outside his purely directly Baha'i service. And I don't know why he's coming to Ohio. I don't know why he's speaking on these subjects. There may be some particular purpose that the Board of Councillors has in conjunction with the National Assembly, or it may be a matter of happenstance. I remember when I was a councillor, sometimes I would have to travel for a professional meeting, and while I was there, I'd take a few days, if I could carve out the time, and visit with Baha'i communities. That may be the reason, or there may be some other purpose. If there is some other purpose, I'm certainly not aware of it. Yes?
I have a question that goes back to your your own impressions of the,
Yes.
of the pilgrim notes and things
Yes,
related
sure.
to New York
Sure.
story and other
Sure.
cities. When Baha'is were counseled or urged to leave the cities
Yes.
and go out into the country,
Right.
what might your understanding of the value to
Yes.
themselves and to the
Yes.
faith as a whole have been for
Yes.
that urging?
Yes, that's a good question. It refers to the fact that in the mid-1950s you find that there were very clear guidance from the World Centre calling upon the Baha'is to leave the large cities where there was a concentration of Baha'is and to settle in areas where there were no Baha'is, which were principally the rural areas. And that much is well known, but there was more to those messages, and we've had occasion to look at it very recently. And the more to it seemed to be of two kinds. One, the Guardian referred to unsuspected hazards and dangers hanging over those large cities. Now you can take that in many ways. You can take that in terms of people dropping bombs on the cities, or you can take it in terms of the breakdown of urban life that's occurring in the large cities, the crime, the pollution, the dehumanization of large cities, the overpopulation, and so on. You can take it one of many ways. The Guardian also, as I recall, referred to the fact that our needs were not for large concentrations of Baha'is at that time, but rather for a thin network of assemblies and localities over the surface of the earth. Now it's 30 years later, 33, 32 years later. We still need more assemblies and localities, but we also have emerged from obscurity. And because we've emerged from obscurity, it's a whole new ball game. The needs of 10 years ago are not the needs of today. We have to attract attention to the faith in areas where there is secular influence. We have to reach new strata of society. I could envisage in the next few years Baha'is moving into New York City to serve the faith. And that's radically different from the way it was 10 years ago. Why would they do that? It would, for example, be Baha'is who have particular credibility in the world of business or commerce or the media or international relations. Because New York is a center of commercial and financial influence. It's a center of very prestigious media activity. The New York Times, a lot of national magazines, and the United Nations is centered there. It'd be very useful for us to have more Baha'is who had credibility in the international scene, in the scene of commerce, business, or in media credibility, to help us develop a better understanding of the faith in those segments of activity and to attract people to the Baha'i faith from those backgrounds, of which we have very few. I remember talking about this in Wilmette a couple of days ago, and I had with me the Secretary of the National Assembly, Robert Henderson, who interrupted my answer and added this anguished remark, we also need them to help organise the World Congress. So he had a vested interest in people moving New York City. Recently, within the last year, a Baha'i, and I'm being deliberately vague about this to protect his sort of private business, a Baha'i who has eminence in a field of endeavour, a very practical field of endeavour, was living in a large city of the United States, and it's all very vague, I'm sorry. And he and his wife, who's a Baha'i, thought that maybe they could best serve the faith by going overseas pioneering. And they wrote to the House of Justice and said, we'd like your advice. And the House wrote back, and I saw the letter, and they said, it'll be great if you go pioneering overseas. Wherever you go, you'll be a great help to the faith. But since you've asked us, we feel you're better off staying in this large city in the United States. Well, that's a city that has several hundred Baha'is in it. And here they're saying to this Baha'i couple, you're better off staying there. Because that Baha'i, in fact, both of them, have entree to an influential section of American society that we don't seem to be able to reach any other way at the moment. So it's a new ball game with this emergence from obscurity, and the guidance of 30 years ago was essentially strategic, as I understand, in terms of the needs at that time, and the strategy dictates other considerations at the present time. It doesn't mean everybody who's in New York City or Los Angeles should stay there. It has to be looked at in context, in terms of opportunities and so on. But it means we can't make as general statements as we could in the past when our needs were less complex or less diverse. Yes?
Could you talk about the 1992 being a holy year to significance?
Yes, it's another good question. Concerning 1992, the House of Justice has given us a 6-year plan which terminates at Rizwan 1992, and they've said that that year from 92 through 93 is designated as a holy year. And the question concerns its significance. Well, this is a sort of question that merits our own thought, and I'm sure whatever I say to you now will seem very trite and trivial to me in 6 months or a year's time as I think about it further. But as I understand it, it is centred around the fact that 1992 marks the centenary of the unfoldment of Baha'u'llah's covenant. Represents 100 years since Baha'u'llah passed away. That, of course, is significant. It's the centenary of the passing of Baha'u'llah, but even more significant is the fact that 1992 is a centenary of the beginning of the unfoldment of Baha'u'llah's covenant. It's a beginning, it's a centenary of the beginning of that period when a unique covenant designed to bring about and guarantee and preserve unity and integrity and dynamism and creativity in a religion was brought to mankind. And you look at religious history, it never happened before. Religions ossified. They became defenders of orthodoxy, resistant to change, corrupt, impure. They lost their integrity. They split into sects and divisions. This won't occur at the present time in this dispensation because of the covenant. Therefore, the centenary of the beginning of its operation in the world is a period of great significance, and my understanding is that that year the Baha'i activity will continue to expand and consolidate, but also there will be a lot of concentration on exploration of the significance of the covenant and the unity and the integrity it brings about and ensures. So it's a year almost of celebration in the broader sense, not like a celebration that we do, but celebration in its classic sense. To celebrate the wonder of the gift brought to mankind with that covenant. So that's the kind of things I see in it. And as I say, whatever I'm saying will probably seem very trivial 6 months or a year time, because it's a sort of concept that as we each meditate on, we'll get more insight into. Let's take a couple more and then we'll stop. Yes?
Lately we see in the media indications of a change in China.
Yes.
And from your perspective in the World Center, is it a change not only in China but other parts of the world where the faith has not made great inroads? Do we see things beginning to happen there? Is there interest in the faith from people with influence?
Yes, the question concerns the fact that the media indicates change in China, which ultimately must lead to the opening of mainland China for the active propagation of the faith. Is there similar change observable in other parts of the world? And the answer very definitely is yes. And I think of no more dramatic example than Japan. Because for many years, the Baha'is in Japan have laboured with exemplary devotion to spread the Baha'i faith in Japanese society, which was largely resistant to interest in religion. Japan was bent upon reconstructing itself after World War II, has built up this massive industrial base, this vast technology, the very developed high-tech society that characterizes much of Japan at the present day. The Japanese Baha'is, with whom I'm in contact reasonably closely, more out of personal desire than out of the necessity of my work, tell me that Japanese society is now changing. For a start, people are no longer committed to staying with the company for the rest of their lives. They're shopping around. They're saying, I don't need to work 20 hours a day, 6 days a week, and take 1 or 2 weeks vacation a year. I want to take more time for things other than work. I want to have longer vacations. I want to explore other dimensions of their life. That monolithic character of their commitment to their work is breaking down. This is good and bad. It leads to aimlessness and purposelessness and the like, but it's also part of the process of searching. Japanese councillors and National Assembly members have said to me that there is a interest in spiritual issues and spiritual values now appearing in Japanese society. I said to them, what is your evidence? They said there are several kinds of evidence. One, the kinds of books that are selling on newsstands at airports and in news books shops and whatever, more and more are books about spiritual things. People are intrigued by it. They said there are more specials on TV. There are more discussion in news interview programs on TV of spiritual issues. There's a turning in the society towards that. And of course the foreign policy developments in the Southwest Pacific in the last few months, I think, will heighten the sense of Japan that it can't keep going the way it has before. It's got to look at new approaches, and it's seeing itself more as a member of the Pacific community and as well as of Southeast Asia. So that we see as the cause of the fact that in the last year and a half the Japanese Baha'i community is really moving ahead. It's been very difficult before, and now we see significant changes. The self-confidence of the Japanese Baha'i community and in their initiative in travel teaching into areas of the Pacific and the like. The same we see in Cuba. We've had a brave National Spiritual Assembly surviving in Cuba over all these years, despite many, many difficulties. The National Assembly of Cuba has hung in there, preserved the faith. We have a very small handful of local assemblies. What we find now is that the government of Cuba appears more receptive to what the Baha'i faith has to offer. And this has come about largely through the Cuban government becoming aware of the uniqueness of our teachings on the equality of men and women. That has been the handle that seems to be opening the door in Cuba. There's probably other things going on as well, but certainly the conditions, the flexibility. We've had radio, and I think, I'm not sure about TV, but I think TV programs, but certainly radio programs in Havana in the last year or two on the faith by Baha'is. Baha'is have been interviewed on the faith in Cuba. It's unprecedented. So certainly in those two, but I think, if I was to keep talking, there's lots of other places where I see similar kinds of change in areas where it was previously no interest at all discernible. Now we see significant interest in the faith. Yes, let me take just one more and then we'll stop because there's kinds of other things to do. Yeah.
There is a rumor circulating in Columbus that Mr. Gorbachev was given the peace message while he was in Geneva.
Yes.
That he read it, and went back to Moscow and appointed some Baha'is to make sure that all Baha'i writings were available in Russian.
Yes.
Is that right?
I'm certain he was not given it by the Baha'is in Geneva. If he had appointed someone to look into the Baha'i writings, and if it had been a Baha'i, I think I'd know about it, because I tend to hear most things at the World Centre because of being on the teaching centre. So I'm certain those elements of it are not true. He was not given it directly in Geneva, and I am not aware of him having appointed any Baha'i to do anything for him, and I feel confident I would have been informed had the latter occurred, and I'm sure the first didn't occur. What I know happened is that when President Reagan and Premier Gorbachev were having their Geneva meeting, the World Centre was approached about whether it would be appropriate to use that as an opportunity to give the peace message to Mr. Gorbachev, given the fact he'd be in Geneva and we have an active Swiss NSA, and the House of Justice said no. However, they did permit the distribution of the peace message in various languages to the reporters who gathered at Geneva. to cover it, including the Soviet reporters. What they did with that, we don't know. We've had no reports, accurate or inaccurate, about what the reporters did with it. They could have torn it up, they could have passed it to the Soviet government, who knows. We have presented the peace statement to 186 heads of state, directly or indirectly. In the case of the heads of state of the communist countries, the House of Justice decided that the approach to be used was to present it through the ambassador at the United Nations. So copies of the peace statement have been given to the Soviet ambassador at the United Nations for transmission to the head of state and to the premier. Whether that happened, we don't know. If it reached Gorbachev, what his reaction was, we don't know. So we have no information about this. And, I feel reasonably confident that's the kind of thing I would need to be told about by the House of Justice in order to do my job properly, and I've not been told of it, so I feel confident in saying that we have no information about it. There may be all kinds of mysterious things happening that we're unaware of, but there certainly isn't anything that we are aware of. Okay, I think I'm sure there's many more questions, but if you'll excuse me, I think we ought to stop because there's other things we have to do.
Knowledge of the writings. For me, it was very intellectually stimulating, and I'm sure it was for everybody else here. I just have a few announcements before we end. The Baha'is of Detroit are sponsoring a celebration for the 50th anniversary of the incorporation of the local spiritual assembly. And that will be held March 14th at 6:30 p.m. at the International Institute Hall of Flags. There are invitations up here at the podium if anybody is interested, and they could also talk to Viola Clark. She's sitting up here. Also, we realize that many people have traveled long distances tonight, and we appreciate it very much.